Fortune and glory, kid. Fortune and glory.
Where does Temple of Doom rank for you? I only ask because people tend to either enjoy this one the most or place it last behind Raiders and Crusade. I'm in the latter camp, but it's close.
You have chosen wisely.
When I was a kid, this was definitely my favorite of the pair. Crusade hadn't been created yet, and while now I prefer the World War II setting of the opening and final chapters, Temple is still a great thrill to watch due to how different it is. A roller coaster ride, both figuratively and literally. It was the first violent, scary movie I'd ever seen, so it created a lasting impression and opened me up to a lot of 80s horror flicks. I had my first lemon lime Gatorade when we rented it on VHS back in the day because somehow that's relevant. That glass bottle though, people. Indiana Jones and the Glass Bottle People. Lucas's new script, have you heard of it? Wouldn't surprise me. There's an orange Gatorade that talks like an Eastern stereotype. You've gotta see this. Temple of Doom is an odd, dark chapter packed with tons of hokey fun. We all know series co-creator George Lucas was going through a divorce at the time, so I won't rehash that tired old story. Either way, I consider this the Lucas Indiana Jones movie. Corny one-liners, absurd plot contrivances, inhuman dialogue, and flippant racial stereotypes that go out of their way to be as outrageous as possible. Regardless of how I feel about Lucas, the man understood how to pen a trilogy in his younger years. The Empire Strikes Back was the dark chapter in between two similar feeling films, and Temple of Doom does the same. Oh, but it's a prequel? Get out of here, fanboys. These were always intended to be cheesy one-off nods to the old episodic serials. Nothing matters but the action. No real emotions, no timey-wimey bullshit. They're simple fun. That's why Indy barely has a personality, and the sole reason it all should have ended after The Last Crusade, where they literally had him ride off into the sunset. But we'll get there. For now, Temple of Doom, specifically the original arcade game released a year after the film dropped in 1985, and its clunky 1988 sorta, but kinda not really port on the Nintendo Entertainment System. Why and how Atari were given the license after their 2600 blunders is beyond me. There was just something about these Atari arcade games that turned me off.
No, yeah.
I've spoken about Batman and how it just couldn't shut up long enough to be even remotely enjoyable, but Temple of Doom isn't half bad. For one thing, it was the first time digitized samples were used in an Atari System 1 unit, which would be more impressive if it sounded less like a pinball machine on bath salts. No hate on pinball machines, but just listen to this thing.
No. Yeah. No. Yeah.
John Williams' iconic music, voice clips from the movie. No.
Yeah.
No.
Yeah. No. Don't. Rule the world.
Wow, the Harrison Ford. It's like I'm in the Temple of Doom, but only the second and third acts. Credit where it's due, this machine looks and plays pretty well. Unlike other units floating around like Road Blaster and Road Runner, I never had the chance to play this out in the wild. Obviously, I'm playing this emulated through MAME, but I also have zero hands-on experience with the real machine. Still, this is of a higher quality than the majority of Atari arcade games released in the 80s. Different difficulty settings, looks like Quake took a bit of inspiration here. Easy is reasonable unless you've been playing too long without dying. If the participant is doing well, Mola Ram goes haywire with the fireball projectiles, randomly spawning frustratingly frequently, which makes it difficult to get anything accomplished. A single death results in him easing back a bit, or at least that's what it felt like to me. Other obstacles such as thuggy guards, spikes, conveyor belts, super fun slide mazes, bats, fire pits, and exploding barrels appear everywhere, but most enemies announce their arrival so they feel fair, unless you're doing well.
Welcome.
Oh, and of course there are snakes. whip the thuggies to watch them do an inspired Russian folk dance. Beautiful. Whipping guards repeatedly causes them to fall off the screen temporarily, but there's always another around the next corner. Something of a pet peeve of mine are games that force the player too close to the edge of the screen. This arcade version isn't an egregious example of this, but it's tight at times. The controls are fairly smooth, but occasionally it can be rather tricky to align Indy up with platforms due to the perspective, specifically during the final wave of the game when ridges surrounded by lava are introduced more regularly. One bad step, and there are 3 loops that play out 4 times. Basically, the goal is to collect all of the Sankara stones that appeared in the film. Pretty faithful overall. All of these are distinct and great fun, with the 4th loop replacing the altar scene with one that replicates the bridge finale. The first stage in every sequence has Indy releasing slave kids from cages, the second is a clumsy minecart chase, and the third revolves around recovering the Sankara stone from the altar. I completed the entire game on easy with next to no trouble, but the normal difficulty setting took a bit more effort, which is to be expected. New traps populate familiar layouts, longer minecart chases with jumps and other obstacles added. This definitely feels like the intended way to play. The way it doles out extra lives through points feels reasonable. When I was doing well, I'd always have an extra Indy rewarded for my efforts. Everything is clearly exhibited with on-screen text, so the objectives are never a mystery. Notably, the machine itself was fitted with an 8-way joystick that could be enjoyed by right and left-handed people.
Come on, you lefties, it's all here, and it's all backwards.
Everything operates smoothly through MAME with my busted up PS4 controller except the minecart segment, but I'll chalk that up to analog issues, as it's pretty doubtful that I'll ever get my hands on the real deal arcade cabinet to be able to have an honest impression. A lot of times it's tough to parse what is going on during these segments due to the camera angle and the sheer amount of obstacles on screen, especially on the higher difficulty levels. At first I'd just rush my way through, but that only got me so far. A calmer, more calculated approach often resulted in a more successful run, but I still can't reliably take down this chief guard when he appears. What a menace. A nice touch is at the end of the line, an explosive barrel can be lit on fire to explode any trailing thuggies.
We walk from here.
The mine carts are a nice addition, but easily my least favorite of the 3 stages. A lot of times they felt like a crapshoot, but I also haven't memorized the game, so that's on me. In lieu of jumping, Indy can grapple and swing from planks of wood to navigate over pits. It's good stuff, and everything here makes me feel like I'm playing as the iconic movie character. He can also whip from ladders, which will become a relevant point later. Falling from short distances won't immediately kill our hero, and the stages loop, which prevents any dead ends. Sometimes it can be tough to find or save that final prisoner. This one on the slide took me an embarrassing amount of time to release, but overall it felt like a me problem. Ultimately, the stages are well designed. Retrieving the stones isn't all that challenging. Simply swing over, avoid the spurts of steam erupting from the fiery pit below, and voila. The backgrounds and characters pop off the screen with colorful clarity. I particularly enjoy the shading on the heroes and villains. Indy, as well as all of the enemies, are identifiable for those who have seen the movie, with limited but impressive animations. It's a frantic, engaging experience from beginning to end that culminates in a well-crafted final duel against the big bad. If you continuously pound on the action button, an extra special ending scene plays out, complete with voice acting, which was a nice attention to detail for the time. After this, a special bonus sequence opens up that introduces the possessed Maharaja of Pankot, complete with Krita doll accessory kit, and more treasures than my mind can possibly comprehend. It's what I think to be an infinite bonus loop, stuffed with gifts and points galore. Amazing! The constant barrage of lines from the movie get on my nerves in a serious way, but ultimately, I'd consider this a successful Atari-made Temple of Doom recreation. Hal Cannon and Dennis Harper's faithful recreations of John Williams' music is solid, but unfortunately it's lacking in Willy screams, which would have added a certain je ne sais quoi. Just remember, the Mola Ram never dies. Thank you, Atari. There were plenty of home ports for the usual BritKit computer devices, but I personally don't have much experience with them. Still, let's have a brief look, starting with the Amiga version. Very choppy with less than ideal hit detection, and god-awful scrolling really brings this thing down. Cannon's recreated score is pretty decent, but that's really the only positive point in my eyes. Speaking of eyes, oh lord, the lava! Indy is way too close to the edge of the screen, which makes it a challenge to not take cheap hits. The smaller window does it no favors, and the minecart is a nearly unplayable, choppy mess. At the very least, it conceptually attempts to recreate what made the arcade game so special, but that could be said for all of these, really. Next up, the Amstrad CPC starring Blue Bobby Indy. Now, either this is running too fast, or the game is just brutally challenging. Take my opinions here with a grain of salt. I don't have any experience with, or nostalgia for, any of these machines except for maybe 2 or 3. I'm merely giving a quick first impression of these ports, and haven't put the time in. Here, I couldn't save more than a couple of kids before getting frustrated. The thuggies are way too aggressive, and the grappling is agonizingly specific. 2 pluses. The music is adequate, and the scrolling is smooth. Still not enough to make me want to play it ever again. Hard pass. The Atari ST version has crystal clear visuals, relatively smooth scrolling with smaller characters that fit nicely into the frame, but again, with the too close for comfort screen movement. This single solitary issue made it far too annoying for me to even want to continue onto the minecart sequence. I can definitely see this one having its fans, but after playing so many ports of this one game, I was starting to get really pissed off with the thuggies seemingly spawning right on top of me. Admittedly, I have a soft spot for the Commodore 64, specifically in how it sounds. Unfortunately, a lot of these ports were published by US Gold, a British company that I'm still not convinced weren't a scam to give North Americans a bad name. Barely a bronze in most cases, but I've gotta say, the music is pure C64 greatness. The movement is excellent, and a young George Lucas complete with black beard appears during the minecart sequence. This is as far as I could get though, because they really ramped up the difficulty for these chases, and having to sit through expectedly lengthy boot up screens really wore me down. The hit detection is also a bit wonky, which I could say for most of these, but call me a fanboy, it's the best of the ports from my perspective by a tiny margin. Choppy, borderline unplayable Apple II, another kit I have a bit of familiarity with from my youth. Great title screen music, but bleeps and bloops while playing. Speaking of bleeps and bloops, DOS! Indy is the enemy here. Possessed Indy staring into my soul. Looks good, very smooth, but again, with the bombardment, way too aggressive. Back off. Nope! This one's interesting. Now that MSX emulation is a lot more stable, I've really started appreciating its library. Temple of Doom runs very well here. It's colorful, charmingly playable, and now Mola Ram blows heart-shaped kisses at our fantastic Fedora friend, which gives the flaming heart a new meaning. On top of that, there's no need to attack thuggies as they voluntarily knock themselves out in fantastic Laurel and Hardy inspired comedic fashion. Just an uplifting, goofy pleasure to play. For our second feature, the one I've played the most and loathed for so many years. I had an entirely different script typed up for this, but let me just introduce this the way it was initially intended. Atari masquerading as Tengen. We all know the story. I've always had a copy of this bastardized NES port. Over the years, I've made bundle trades, sold multiple copies to people simply looking to fill out their collections, buried it in parks all over the country, set it on fire, and yet I still own a copy. Since the 80s, this thing has affixed itself to me like some sort of parasite. I've always thought this to be an abysmal recreation of the arcade game. So abysmal, they released it twice. After Tengen got nailed by the long arm of Nintendo's Gestapo-like law, Mindscape repackaged it in an official form. Vibrant, nauseating colors, stages that make little to no sense, and possibly the worst controls of any 8-bit game I've ever played. Brad Fuller's bleepy bloopy approximations sections of music start out fine, but after swapping caverns for hours on end, it starts to grate on my nerves. I'm probably a bit biased because after being burnt by Raiders of the Lost Ark for the 2600, I stupidly gave Temple of Doom a shot on the NES without any hesitation. Ah, the naivety of youth. Even back in the day, I recognized that Howard Scott Warshaw's attempt at recreating an Indiana Jones adventure was better than this heap. At least it controlled relatively well. How was I to know that this was yet another inferior Atari product pretending to be a proper video game? To be honest, I really enjoyed Tengen back in the day and would often rent their easily identifiable games. Some are among my favorites. RBI Baseball was my ball game of choice on the console for the longest time. Gauntlet always rules. Tetris is better than the Nintendo alternative, I will argue about that all day. Rolling Thunder kicked ass because it felt like I was getting the best of both worlds since I always associated it with Sega, though Shinobi was a whole other kettle of fish. Why was it so impossible to port this classic for the home market? A version so clumsily built that they had to give good old Joe Musashi a life bar. Yikes, kinda defeats the point, yeah? Get this, the Master System had a worse alternative with choppy vertical scrolling. I'm not sure how Sega could do Sega so dirty back in the 8-bit days. As a big Pac-Man fan, it was nice to play a version that didn't look so goddamned heinous. This one on the NES plays second fiddle only to the incredibly tiny arcade toy I played obsessively at my cousin's place as a kid, so yeah, RBI Baseball and Pac-Man alone would have made me buy Temple of Doom. Plus, it was just kinda cool getting these sleek black carts back in the day, despite the fact that they lack the spine label. Never make a product without a spine label. I'm talking to you, Nintendo. Which one of you gray bastards is Excite Bike 64? Motor around! Now, I considered cutting out the chunk where I'm dissing on Temple of Doom on the NES, but reconsidered because I think maybe a lot of you share my disdain. These were my thoughts for decades after numerous attempts at giving this game yet another chance. Like I said, it's always just been there. Many of my opinions remain the same. It's garish. I mean, just look at this title screen. Indy doesn't even want to be here. He looks defeated by life. Touch kid to see a prize? What? The music is also way too hectic. It quite literally gave me a headache after popping it in one final time to capture more footage. So here's the quick story. I played it for this video and realized that I hadn't quite gotten far enough to feel good about reviewing it properly. I've always understood the controls and how the game worked, but something just clicked this time. You know that feeling when you get a new album by a band and it takes a while to sink in? I guess it just took over 3 decades for the Temple of Doom on the NES to grab my attention because I played it all damned day. I'm serious that it gave me a headache too, otherwise I wouldn't have said literally. I'm not one of those idiots. Yeah, so I think I was coming at this all wrong. It's not a port of the arcade original at all. A reimagining would be a better term, as it loosely borrows 2 gameplay types, then refashions them its own way. The waves still exist, but here you're expected to save topless kids in 2 distinct sequences simultaneously. There are minecart sections to each stage, as well as the more explorable, trap-ridden variants, each presented in brain-frying kaleidoscopic color. Man, I wish there was a black and white option here. While we're at it, just, mute the music. Control-wise, I stand by my initial impressions. It's a mess. Indy operates like he was coated by a chimp with greased banana hands, but after a while, you sort of get used to it. He's responsive enough, but jittery in a way that really messes with the comfort. Transitioning from one conveyor belt to the next without plummeting into lava is only half the problem. Fortunately, extra lives are rewarded at every turn with the tried-and-true point method, as well as hidden fedoras found while rescuing slaves. Be sure to stick around after saving one of these kennel kids because an item always appears afterward. The gun kills thuggies dead, but can also be used to reveal concealed grapple points. Somehow the sword has a finite amount of uses, strikes enemies down, and can be swung to destroy shoddily crafted wooden barriers, which more often than not reward the player with this cherry bomb looking thing. It's dynamite, by the way.
Dynamite?
No, like actual dynamite. Somehow this is dynamite and is by far the most useful item in Indy's arsenal. To swap between the 3, it's necessary to hold select in conjunction with one of the 4 points on the directional pad. Up is the TNT, left gun, right sword, and down the whip. It's It's a bit cumbersome, but you should be using all of this gear regularly, so I can understand why the developers opted for this route instead of forcing the player to choose from the menu screen each time. It's more seamless, but oftentimes hectic, especially since the screen doesn't pause at all while doing this. It gets nuts in the later stages where things attack from every which way ceaselessly. The A button uses whichever item is equipped, and Indy can jump this time around with B. B is for boy is the jump busted. Perhaps busted is a bit harsh because it kind of works within the framework of the god-awful perspective. You have to bend your brain a bit here and ignore all logic. Think of these flat environments as three-dimensional, and you're sort of halfway there. Ultimately, it's nonsense, but if you can get past the focal point fuckery, Temple of Doom can be an engaging little puzzle game. Your garden variety group of familiar arcade baddies are mostly here, including a few new ones, such as these plucky little parasitic creatures that barely look like spiders, some chirpy rats for good measure, and boulder-dropping shit kids who deserve to be grounded for life. There are also some lava creatures that appear in the higher waves that need to be used as makeshift platforms, but more on that later. If the music wasn't annoying enough, the needle traps that emerge from certain tiles will make you reaching for the mute button. At first I thought this was the timer ticking down because, yeah, you're doing all of this with a little extra pressure, but nah, it's the traps. Fortunately, the timer never drained to zero for me because during my recent run I stumbled upon level skipping keys that allow entry to locked doors in order to skip to the next wave. You won't get the point and those kids will rot in hell for all eternity, but it makes for a more pleasant experience as this game is long, with some stages requiring over 100 slaves to be saved. No one has the time for that. Screw him. I mean, just look at how exhausted he is here. He's coughing up all sorts of blood and bile. We need to get him out. Get Indy out. Bats are a big problem, but they can be kept at bay by hitting this indiscernible vase or Doggy Kong chew toy looking thing. I don't know, it kind of works like citronelle on mosquitoes. Don't ask too many questions, just ride along with the nonsense. If they or any enemy collides with Indy, he'll spaz out for a bit, twirling around like a breakdancing superstar, but most of the time you're safe unless a thuggy follows up with a sword attack, a rock lands on you, or a lava pit is near. It's forgiving for the most part, and slaves are cleverly placed, which is something I never thought I'd ever say, so you'll need to use your brain weaving between both playable environments to save them. There are plenty of passages and a variety of different ways to reach them. Indy can no longer whip on ladders, which can be a bit frustrating, but the Molo Ram isn't constantly hassling you, so you've got a bit more room to breathe. The game requires patience. Even on the minecarts, it isn't always advisable to rush ahead. Calculated movements will ensure success, especially considering how bizarre the platforming can feel at first. Grappling and swinging is a bit of a chore, as I often landed in pits that I thought could easily be cleared, again with the perspective. Objectives are spelled out between each wave, which is a nice touch, so you'll always have at least an idea of what to do next. TNT apples destroy lava patches somehow, again, don't look too far into it, but they also permanently freeze these demon crocodile things in the smoldering lakes, which is a necessary skill to master. To be completely transparent, I've reached wave 10 numerous times, but I can't get any further. After endless hours of butting my head against the trials and tribulations that occur here, as well as the previous stage, I just can't go on any longer. I commend the developers for switching things up after repetitive slave saving, but crossing this area took me forever and multiple runs because I never had enough explosives. It's possible to walk along the heads of these creatures a la Roger Moore and Live and Let Die, but it's needlessly irritating to accomplish while thousands of thuggies poke and prod you. This is where the game takes a nosedive for me. It's poorly conceived busy work that requires a level of precision I no longer have the patience for. Wave 10 is unforgiving, as the game breaks its own rules by forcing Indy to drop a collected stone upon death. This doesn't happen with any of the other items. I didn't get a game over here and still had plenty of lives, but having to work my way through this maze without dying tired me out. The map screen shows where you need to go, which is a really cool addition. I'd like to say I completed the Temple of Doom after all these years, but without a password to retry this stage until I master it, it'll likely never happen. After decades of despising this thing, I can finally say that I found some enjoyment in its slow, methodical puzzle boxes. Oddly enough, I've recently posted some of my games on eBay to downsize my collection, with this one included, but now I've removed it because I can see the value in owning it, both from a place of nostalgia as well as the amount of enjoyment I had playing it on a day off. It's hardly as good as other games released in 1988, or even a crowning achievement for Tengen's short run of black cart titles, but it's a lot less awful than I remembered. Typically, I tend to only review things that I've completed, but this is going to have to do for now. Temple of Doom is an excellent movie with more than a handful of video game adaptations, the majority being ports of the Atari arcade original. What are your thoughts? Which one is your favorite? The straight up ports from the myriad of computers are impressive, sorta, so tell me about your experiences with them. I tend to only read comments for a day or so, but it's always interesting seeing another perspective. Personally, I don't have any nostalgia for them. We're almost out of the 80s, and there is one more Indiana Jones film, the best in the trilogy in my humble opinion. Surely these developers learned a few things over the course of the decade, so my expectations are high. Next time on this channel, The Last Crusade, so stay tuned.
Hi there folks, US Gold here, Britain's Bronze. We started out distributing quality games to the Western market under this guise, but our main objective was to gain enough clout to confuse North American audiences with piss-poor productions. So let's be honest, North American developers didn't need our help looking bad in the 90s, but with middling titles such as Mega Man for the Game Gear, Izzy's Quest for the Olympic Rings on the Super Nintendo, and let's not forget that horrific, unnecessary Strider sequel for the Mega Drive Genesis, we certainly feel like we succeeded in our goal to take video games down a peg or two. You're so welcome, America.